My name is Sarah Lee. I'm 20 years old, and I'm from North Carolina. Last November, exactly 101 years since the armistice of the Great War, my Penn State contemporary history class went to visit the Allied war graves over in France. I had never been out of the country before, not counting a small 2-day trip up to Canada to see a cousin of mine who was studying in Toronto. So, I was extremely excited to see a little of the world outside of the east coast of the U.S. I even learned a little French to be able to get by, taking a few online classes on basic conversation and asking directions, lessons I worked super hard at too. With every little word I learned, every time I mastered the difficult pronunciations, I got a little bit more excited, to the point where, when it was finally time to pack and drive out to the airport, I was positively shaking with anticipation. But when we arrived, it wasn't quite the dream I had envisioned. Aside from the weather being terrible, the French can be really, really rude to tourists. Like, unfathomably so. It made me realize how nice people can be in the US. Like, sure, we can get a few a-holes that are all like, speak English, this is America. But we certainly don't go around correcting minor mispronunciations, especially if it's a foreigner speaking English, which is exactly what some French people decide to do. I'd asked directions to the nearest patisserie and ended up getting a 10-minute grammar lesson from some dour old lady, and she was actually one of the less rude ones. The really mean French people simply ignored me altogether, or turned to say something like, "I'm sorry, no English," even though I just asked them a question in passable French. After a while, I got over how lame they were, and it helped that there were a lot less nice French people who made up for all the a-holes. But I made up my mind to focus on the reason I was there in the first place, to enrich my knowledge of history with a plethora of physical visits and first-hand sources. So, in a small quaint town, my class visited a war cemetery dedicated to American servicemen who died defending mainland Europe from the German Kaiser's brutal war machine. An American cemetery, the remains of over 6,000 fallen soldiers are interred into a series of plots labeled A to D. Under a blanket of iron-gray clouds, our group walks silently among the rows of pristine white crucifixes, each one representing an American who had ventured to Europe on some great modern crusade, but had not lived to tell the tale. I saw a man in uniform, standing in a small patch of delicately pruned grass that showed no obvious markings of grave sites. This area was marked Plot E. Plot E was not mapped on the plastic notice board that depicted the locations of the grave sites. There were no mentions of it in the visitor guide, no mentions of it in the English language pamphlet, nor any mention of it on the cemetery's website. It was as if the plot didn't exist at all. Officially it didn't. As I walked solemnly toward the uniformed man, I noticed his fatigues were the old kind, the same old olive drab that was worn during the Second World War. I figured he must be some kind of tour guide, a reenactor or something. Then I began to see them. All the 96 white markers, the size of index cards, carrying only a small ID number, no name, no place of birth, just simple little ID numbers that made them appear more like subterranean filing cabinets more than anything else. Unlike the other plots, there were no stars and stripes, no indication that these were Americans at all. It was terribly sad, and I wondered why there was a complete lack of reverence to these graves. But I didn't have to wait long to find out. They were buried with their backs facing the other plots, the man said solemnly. For here, apart from the others, lie the dishonorable dead. He smirked at the look of confusion on my face. U.S. soldiers who happened to be dishonorably discharged by the military before their execution for the sexual assault and murder of European civilians. I see. And whose grave is this one? I asked quietly, pointing down to the small white plaque at his feet. Ah, this one. He smiled, but he couldn't hide that melancholic look in his cloudy gray eyes. This one belongs to a criminally inclined soldier who happened to be caught poaching on some rich English aristocrat's country estate. They were caught, an argument ensued, and the landowner received a single gunshot wound to the head. The murderer was a Pennsylvanian man. His name, George E. Smith. There he lies, like Corporal Clark and Private Guerrera over there, he said, gesturing to a pair of the small white markers, who savagely assaulted and strangled a 15-year-old girl while based over in the UK. Or Louis Till, a black soldier executed for his alleged involvement in the murder of an Italian woman. Louis Till, sir? The same seems so familiar, but for all the wrong reasons. That's right, Emmett's father, hanged on the foreign shores while his son was just 3 years old, a dark foreshadowing of his own death just 11 years later. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was the very same Emmett Till whose mother gave him that open casket funeral to show the world how terrible her son had been treated in his final moments. How must she have felt, knowing she lost her husband and son in the exact same way. A false accusation, jumped upon with such violent zeal that her loved ones were taken away within moments of their supposed transgressions. How could she have coped with that? How could anyone have coped with that? It was exactly how the guy had phrased it. A foreshadowing, like Emmett's death had been decided many years before. His fate entwined with that of his father's in the most hideous way possible. It's the most intensely creepy fact that I've ever come to terms with. One that made me question my entire worldview. To wonder if there really is a plan. God's plan. The devil's, whatever, for some people. Maybe, just maybe, there are people out there that are really just doomed. You see, I am from Hong Kong, and I work at Pak Fu Lam Cemetery, one of the most overcrowded burial grounds in the entire world. Constructed in 1882, the private Pak Fu Lam Cemetery on the western side of Hong Kong Islands is an absolutely magnificent sight. Even having lived here all my life, its grandiosity is something that has never grown mundane for me. Built into the mountainside, and terraced steps and interconnected with staircases, the cemetery resembles a giant outdoor amphitheater. My story starts just before the festival we call Qingming, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day. The festival in early April dates back to 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. On this day, families will visit their deceased relatives' gravesites to clean them. This is mainly a show of respect to our ancestors, to show how we keep them in our thoughts and prayers. But it is also a status thing, as a family with clean and well-tended graves is the most worthy of prestige. And due to the extreme overcrowding of the cemetery, where some families can pay over $30,000 for the privilege of being buried there, some years we have to do a fair amount of work before the family visits even commence. And sometimes, this work is not pretty. So, last April, I was given the job of moving some remains into a newer gravesite to make room for those who had paid vast sums of money for the most attractive burial sites. It's something I'd never done before, and quite frankly, I was dreading it. Cultural taboos of moving a person's remains aside, it was apparently some of the hardest, most grueling work for me and my colleagues would ever have to do. Wrapped up in layers of protective equipment on some of the most humid days of the year, those charged with the task had to be meticulous to be able to move remains up and down hundreds of sets of stairs without losing so much as a speck of dust or bone. And so it came to be that one very early morning, I put on my mask, goggles, and forensic suit. We have a name for this in Cantonese, but this is the most accurate translation, and set about beginning my task. I worked 8 hours straight on just breaking the grave seal. Since we have to move the entire grave, along with the remains, every piece has to stay intact and undamaged. This was a very old and unkempt grave too, one which the family of the deceased had happily accepted money from a wealthier family for. With a cash injection resulting from this, they could afford to spruce the gravesite up a little, or maybe even keep the money for themselves. But that was unlikely. I could not even read the name on the headstone. It had been worn away by the elements over the years, so I was hoping the family would invest in making the grave look a little more presentable. The next day came, and it was time to actually start bagging up the remains. It was a painstaking process, collecting every individual bone after breaking through the rotten wood coffin that housed the body. I came to realize that it's also a very hard task because you're faced with your own mortality. Yes, being around a cemetery all day, 5 days a week, makes you reflect on death. But our jobs are consumed with the banalities of maintenance and cleaning tasks, and so it is easy to distract oneself with smaller jobs so that the overall theme of death slips quietly into the background. But it is not possible to compartmentalize so effectively when faced with another's human corpse. Picking through this long dead person's bones was horrific, singling out each little piece of them, placing the pieces into the relevant plastic bag. It was seeing a human being in their most basic pieces, like a broken down Lego set that would be impossible to reconstruct. It made me think of how fragile we are, how temporary and fleeting our lives are. Parts of us do stick around, longer after we're dead, just not the pieces we want. Now, I feel I need to preface this by saying that I do not believe in the supernatural or the paranormal. I know there is a perfectly rational explanation for what happened to me during this time, but it's an explanation that has thus far escaped me. You see, on the nights after I began performing these tasks, I began to have the strangest dreams. Ones in which I would be working in a cemetery, only to be approached by a young woman who was apparently visiting her ancestors' graves. She was very beautiful, tall for a girl in Hong Kong, and chose to dress in a very traditional Chinese style, instead of the Western dress that seems to be much more popular here, especially among younger people, such as myself. It was a very lucid dream, so lucid that when I awoke, I had the woman's name on my lips. Her name was Li Yan-Kei, and all the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the dream I had about her. The dreams persisted for a few nights, departing and returning as the week dragged on, and I didn't really think of anything until the time came to restore the engraving and painting on the tombstone itself. We had to consult an old handwritten database to discover the name of the person interred in that particular plot. These were huge, thick tomes, retrieved from the back of some dusty vault somewhere, and if it wasn't for the meticulous organization of these records, our job would have taken much, much longer to complete. Only when I came to the records of the remains I had been excavating, I thought I must have made some kind of mistake. The family's name, Li, then the middle name, Yan, were the first words I read. I immediately thought of the reoccurring dream I'd been having, the one with the pretty girl saying hello as she visited her deceased relatives. I dreaded saying the next word, desperately hoping it wouldn't be K. And I thank God that it wasn't. It was Fan. The deceased person I had been moving was named Li Yan Fan, but that wasn't enough to calm me down. It was still far too much of a coincidence that the family name and middle name of this dream girl and the dead person were exactly the same. The dreams started to abate once the remains had been moved and the grave sealed up again. There were no more nightly visits from Li Yan-Kei. I still can't quite explain why I had those dreams, but I am almost certain that it was just my way of processing the stressful, painstaking process of moving a once living person's remains. But even when I try to rationalize what happened, I never failed to be intensely creeped out and uncomfortable.